I know. Wow. Okay, those of you that know me know I don't even need a mic, but um, and as I've said multiple times today, please read the bios of our presenters. Again, as I mentioned, all of our presenters do this on their own. They don't receive any compensation from us, so we are so grateful. And Eric Garza is actually on Guardians for New Futures board of directors, and he wasn't here this morning, but we want to recognize him. So he will be our next speaker. So again, please look at the bios because we have some amazing speakers. So thank you.
Okay. I think I'm... Can you guys hear me on the microphone? Yes? Dot, yes? And no? How about now? Perfect. Okay. All right, so I'm going to go ahead and get started and talk to you guys about the wonderful topic of shame. Definitely a difficult conversation to have at times, but I'm going to try my best to spin it in the best of lights for everybody. So the topic for this training is how shame develops in children and the cycle of shame. So I wanted to start off with a quote from Brené Brown. She says that shame is the most powerful master emotion. It's the fear we're not good enough. And what you'll see in this presentation is that shame intertwines into a lot of the items that we do every single day. And once it takes root into an individual, it can have a significant impact on that individual's life. As a result of this presentation, what you will be able to do is be able to define shame. You'll be able to identify the causes of shame, understand how shame repeats in children, know how shame looks like in children, and also learn how to reduce the impact of shame in children. So a lot of focus is going to be on children and shame. So I wanted to start off with the basic definitions that Webster has for each, shame and guilt. Shame is defined as a painful emotion caused by consciousness of guilt or shortcoming, whereas guilt is the fact of having committed a breach of conduct, especially violating law and involving a penalty. So what you'll see as the slides go through is a distinct difference between shame being more long-term and internal, whereas guilt is typically short-term and external. As you guys can see here from this complicated illustration that I have for you guys, shame is typically represented as I am bad, whereas guilt is I did something bad. So the individual under guilt threw the piece of paper on the floor, which is external, and if that was my daughter and I caught her doing that, I would say that is not okay for you to do that, and she would be guilty of doing that. Whereas in the illustration for shame, the paper is crumbled inside. So the individual feels that they are a bad person, that they have done something bad themselves. Again, internal versus external. Brené Brown, who you guys will see a lot in this presentation, and I highly recommend that you guys watch her to TED Talks, anything she has on books, probably the leading researcher right now when it comes to shame and vulnerability. What she identifies is guilt is just as powerful, but its influence is positive, while shame is destructive. Shame erodes our courage and fuels disengagement. So guilt, when used correctly, can correct a behavior because an individual will feel accountable for what they've done. And when they feel accountable in that brief moment, the hope is that they don't continue to do that behavior over and over again. But the focus is on the behavior, not the individual themselves. Whereas with shame, as it starts to root itself within the individual, they may no longer want to continue to try to do that behavior to master it in the future. Because in life, what we have are very similar situations that occur over and over and over again. But if we avoid those situations because we think that we're going to make a mistake again, then we're less likely to follow through with them again. And finally, what you guys will see again in the definitions of shame and guilt, it's typically body language, an individual covering their face, an individual looking away. And interestingly enough, I started to see this with my 2-year-old daughter recently, where if she doesn't get what she wants, she'll run away into the hallway, lay down, put her head against the carpet, and cry. Where she learned that behavior, I have no idea. But she has already started to do some of those behaviors of covering herself. And so what you'll see here again, from the expulsion of Adam and Eve, is that the behavior itself was eating the apple, but then the feeling of shame of, I have done something truly wrong, is the feeling of shame that they are holding internally. And you can see the pain on their face, so much so that he has to cover it from everybody. So what I'll be showing you guys is how this cycle continues over and over again. And some of the presenters that may present today or tomorrow may have a similar cycle. And this is a traditional way that we see how thoughts and emotions are intertwined with each other. What you will find is an activating event, something that occurs in an individual's life, an emotion that they feel, and in this sense, it is shame, usually associated with anger or sadness. And then from there, a thought of, I am not good enough, usually also called an irrational thought or a cognitive thought. And then a behavior that follows suit from how they feel, whether it's avoidance or aggression. And then there's an external reinforcement. Usually this is an adult who reinforces that behavior. And when that occurs, that cycle continues to go over and over again. And I will illustrate that to you guys further on in the PowerPoint. So this young man is going to be our example of how shame can develop in an individual. So we'll use an example that occurred when he was 5 years old. When he was 5 years old, he really, really liked to go fishing. Still to this day, he likes to go fishing. Not so much catching, but he definitely likes to go fishing. And so he can clearly remember that there was a time where his father and his father's friend would always come home and they would want to go fishing. And on one day, when this individual was about 5 years old, I believe, his father's friend came home and he was wearing a football hat on, and it just so happened to be the hat that this individual wore to always go fishing. So he knew Dad and his friend are going fishing. So he asked his dad, can I please go fishing with you guys? And the dad said, sure, just run to your room, get ready, and then come on back, and then we'll go fishing. So this individual went running to his room as fast as he could, changed his clothes, put on his hat, came back out, and what he saw in the living room was his dad and his friend pulling out in the driveway. I know, sad, I know. So then from there, so that's the activating event, okay? So then from there, this individual then went over to his mom and said, Mom, can you believe this happened? And Mom said, well, next time you got to get ready faster. And so this individual felt even more sad and started to think, man, next time I'm going to be ready on time. Next time I'm going to be ready before I even have to be ready. And this individual did the same thing where he laid down on the floor and started crying his eyes out. And so from there forward, this individual was always ready. He stuck to the model of, if you're on time, you're late. Because he did not want to have this experience ever again in his life. And so sometimes When it comes with shame, again, shame doesn't have to be an abusive situation, a traumatic situation. It can be any genuine situation in life. But because it starts from internal, it can start to fester and start to impact other areas of life. Now, my wife would say, what's so bad with being on time all the time, right? However, there's a lot of planning that goes with having to be on time, 30 minutes anywhere that you go, having to be prepared, having to practice over and over again. So that can be very stressing, especially to my wife. Now you guys know that this is me. And she doesn't like going to the movie theaters and being there 30 minutes before the movie theater is going to start. She likes to get there right when the credits start. But again, what happens is you have this reoccurring situation in an individual from a genuine, simple, non-threatening event. And I do need to say that my parents are good parents. You know, they thought that they handled it the best way that they could. Now, could my father have used a different parenting strategy and said to me, no, you're not going to be able to go because it's pretty windy outside and we're afraid that being on the boat, your safety might be impacted. But he didn't, you know, and so the parenting strategy that he used was then matched with my mother's, where she didn't kind of help me address how I was feeling in that moment and recorrect what I was actually feeling. So that stuck with me. So what you see here again up top is next time, be ready faster. The feeling I was feeling was shame, sad, and angry. And the three of those usually go hand in hand together. And then what I started to say to myself was, I always have to be ready. And what led to that was overcompensating to always be ready. And again, still to this day, one of the things that gets highlighted on my evaluations when I meet people is, that Eric, he's always got his things 2 days ahead of time. And here's where it comes from, okay? But that praise fuels that thinking again and again and again. And I'll talk a little bit later what I had to do to kind of calm that down a bit. A little bit marriage, a little bit other stuff. So, yes. So, as I said, events and irrational thoughts are correlated with each other. What you have are other examples, and to me, these are more extreme examples. What I shared with you guys was more of a typical thing that could happen with any individual who may not have experienced any type of trauma, but still have shame develop in them. So some examples are sexual development. So what this means is twofold. I can tell you that in my family, sexual development, we didn't talk about that. You know, that was the devil's work. I can remember there was a hallway that had a picture of like the saddest Jesus picture right near the bathroom. I didn't know why it was right near the bathroom. I do now because, you know, Jesus is watching you, so you have to make sure that you don't commit a sin. Yes. So the other thing that comes with that, though, is imagine individuals who are gay or are lesbian, and they don't necessarily fit within the conservative family norm or whatever the family has already presented to the individual. As an individual starts to get older and older, they may start to say, if I don't fit within the structure of my family, does that mean that there's something wrong about me? And if they're not able to express that and they avoid it, right, because again, it's more internal, and they're not able to process it, that belief keeps increasing over and over again, and it starts to creep into other areas of their life, like their school, their social interactions, drug use, you name it, it starts to kind of creep into that. So that's how sexual development can go from there. And quite frankly, we all around the age of 12 or 13 start to have some type of sexual development change. And if we've grown up in a home where that is suppressed, that is going to be very difficult to manage regardless of who you are. Another thing that happens that I see quite often, not so much because I don't see as many children anymore, but when I did, was with children who are impulsive. So in my time, I started as a therapist around 2009. There was this huge shift of kids who were ADHD. Kids who are impulsive, kids can't sit still, kids are always moving around. And so imagine a 4 or 5-year-old kid who has had the luxury of just running all over the place, having a great time at home, and then he gets to kindergarten and he's expected to sit still for 8 hours. And how is that going to work? It's a significant shift. And then every single time that they try to do something, even when they go outside and play, it's going to be to that extreme amount. So I'm not going to walk up the ladder on the slide. I'm going to run and probably skip a couple of those bars on there. And then instead of sliding down feet first, I might go down head first, So an individual of that age, their thoughts are very pure. Their emotions are very pure. And if they're recorrected very frequently, that child will start to think, there must be something wrong with me because there's nothing I can do that's good enough for my teacher. Nothing I can do for my mom, my dad. And they start to suppress that. They stop communicating as much. They stop engaging other people as much. And impulsive people are some of the most creative people on this planet because they just say things as soon as they think. They don't even think it. They just say it sometimes. And at an early age, if they start to be suppressed, imagine the amount of creativity that we've lost in that individual because they believe no matter what they do, there's something wrong with it or it's incorrect. So another item is sports. So with sports, there's always this unrealistic expectation of being the best, of making every single free throw, of making every single tackle, of making every single run matter for a track runner. Faster, faster, faster. And if you're not, then there must be something wrong with you. And in our society, what we do, especially with our kids start to turn 3, I know when my daughter gets a little bit older, I'm going to go ahead and start putting her in sports. And so that starts that mentality again of having to be faster, stronger. And if you're not, especially for males, you get that label of not being man enough. And I'll talk about that a little bit later on of how that spreads out in an individual. One of the things that I'm briefly going to point out here, social media, we'll talk about it a little bit more in a specific slide. It's unrealistic expectations occur on social media, and there's never a chance to turn that off. And so you'll see in another slide later on that we'll talk about that and how shame continues to develop in an individual. And finally, the most corrosive one of them all is really abuse. Whether it's sexual abuse, physical abuse, an individual that goes through this may experience what they call grooming. A grooming behavior is usually starting off with something warm of you're a nice person, I really love you. And then with the behavior of hitting the individual or sexually abusing the individual, and then repeating that pattern over and over until the individual is left with, there must be something wrong with me. I am damaged goods. This is reason why nobody wants to talk to me. And it can be very corrosive for many individuals that have experienced some type of abuse. Some examples of unhealthy thoughts, I've talked about this a little bit, also known as irrational thoughts are, I'm not good enough, I'm a failure, I'm ugly, no one loves me, I have to be perfect. Now, I'm not a betting person because I'm very cheap with my money, but I would have to believe that most people in this room at one time in their life have said one of those things to themselves. And it is a very difficult comment to say to yourself and not have somebody recorrect that thought for you. So when we get a lower grade on a test or whenever we don't do so good on an evaluation, most individuals tend to go to something negative than to something positive. And it usually trickles back down to some childhood experience that was not processed in the correct way. So one of the items that I mentioned in the last slide had to do with sports. There's a great documentary on Netflix called The Mask You Live In that I would significantly encourage all of you to watch. If you don't have Netflix, ask a friend to borrow the account. That's what I do, but don't tell them. And you're able to watch a lot of great shows that way. And so in this presentation, what you see is there's a coach who pretty much created this documentary, and it's about the male perception of being a man and the fallacies that go with having to be a man. It could be, toughen up, no crying, you can't show love, and what that does over time can slowly corrode an individual. So what you have here, go ahead and give it time to change, okay, is a coach says, boys don't cry. So I've seen this sometimes when I used to play soccer, where if there was a hard slide tackle or somebody would get hurt and you would start to cry, most 8-year-olds would cry. That's kind of what you're supposed to do whenever you get kicked in your shin and with cleats. It hurts. And so when the coach says this and your peers look around you and they expect you to man up, we start to feel that shame and that anger of, I'm not going to feel like this. I'm not going to show any weakness because I don't want my team to be any more weak than what it needs to be. And we start to say in ourselves, I am not weak, I don't cry. And what that leads to is hiding the sadness from others and showing more anger, because in our society, especially for males, somehow it's acceptable to be angry and hit and put holes in walls, but it's not okay to cry, which is sad within itself. We're almost not allowed to feel that way. But that is a genuine, full emotion that all males need to be able to feel so that when they develop and grow up and have children or mentor children, they can then share that emotion and encourage that individual to feel that emotion as well. But what then happens from there is others not seeing me cry, and I get praise from my coach for being more manly or being stronger. And so what does that do? It reinforces that thought of, I'm not going to do this again. I'm not going to cry in front of my peers. And that cycle repeats over and over again. So the big question here is, does shame impact everyone the same way? In some ways, yes. In some ways, no. Just like this picture here, some of you see what? A duck. While some of you see what? A rabbit, yes. I actually showed this to a friend, and he said he saw a goat, and I said he needs to see a therapist. So yes, we all see things differently in life. So let us start with cognitive development, and I'm not going to go through all of the stages of cognitive development. I'm just going to focus on early childhood, specifically with what we call concrete operational stage. This usually starts around the age of 7, usually after an individual has experienced something significant. Usually that has to do with like loss or somebody dying. That's one of like the big questions that I get is, how do I talk to my 5-year-old about somebody passing away? The reason it's a big conversation is because concretely, that individual was in their life. And now, that individual is no longer in their life. And being able to tell the difference of one from the other is very difficult for them because the way that they determine things is cause and effect. They don't have the ability yet to think outside the box. They take a lot of their reasoning and their thoughts from experiences and patterns. So for example, for me, when my father left, I concretely thought he left because I wasn't ready on time, and cause and effect. And with my mom saying you should have gotten faster or ready faster, that cemented that concrete thought as well. If I would have experienced this later on in life in the formal operational stage, I might have perceived it a little bit differently. I might have said, you know what, Dad does this quite a bit. Dad will tell me to go run, go get ready, and then he leaves. Maybe he's a little anxious of saying no to me. Maybe he doesn't know how to do that. Maybe he just doesn't want me to go fishing anymore because I bother him to put the worm on the hook. And in this age group, you start to have that outside-the-box thinking. You start to be able to rationalize different things outside of the equation, kind of like algebra, even though I hate algebra, but it's kind of like that, where you're able to start to figure out different meanings without the full information in front of you. You're also starting to be able to ask the what-if questions, those magical questions. The bad thing with this, though, is it can lead to more and more thoughts that are really unrealistic, thoughts that really have nothing to do with what just happened. And so, for example, like in front of me right now, I see some people that are on their phones, I see some people that are looking down, I see some people that are walking. I can ask my, what if I'm just not being interesting? What if I'm just not doing this? What if I'm just not doing that? And that might not have anything to do with what you guys are doing. But for a 12-year-old, where that thought process starts to develop, it can be very difficult at times, and using it in the right way. So, differences between females and males. Females, what we tend to see most often are unrealistic appearance expectations. Very frequently, what you see on social media, and I'll talk a little bit more about this, is you have these photoshopped images that our young girls see, or these videos of what a teen woman might look like, and it's a movie star. Unfortunately, that's an unrealistic expectation that some of these young girls have to live up to, and it's an unrealistic standard for them. So they're always questioning, am I skinny enough? Am I pretty enough? Does my hair look good enough? And when you repeat those thoughts over and over, it can really eat at an individual and also create some unhealthy habits that we'll talk a little bit later on about. Social status. How many friends do you have? I guess they don't use Facebook, but how many friends do they have like on Instagram, or how many followers do they have on Snapchat? That all is very important to kids nowadays. And if they don't have enough, then there must be something wrong with them. They must not be as popular as the other girl or the other guy. Not being smart enough comes up quite a bit as well for females. What we see cognitively is usually girls develop a little bit faster than boys with their verbal and their cognition. And so this pattern starts to pick up a little bit sooner for females than with boys. And the last one is sexual behaviors. There's a lot of pressure, unfortunately, nowadays for our 10, 11, 12-year-olds to send pictures of themselves or to do certain things that their friends might be doing. And if they don't, then they're not part of that group that's doing it. And that's a very unhealthy pattern there. And what they may also hear is, Mary Sue is doing X with her boyfriend. Does that mean that I should be doing the same thing? And if I'm not, then there must be something wrong with me. This happens even more with males. It's always the conversation that we get is, how big am I? Am I big enough? When am I going to have sex? Is usually the conversation that we have with most actually 11, 12, 13-year-olds. And what happens is they have, again, these unrealistic expectations of what sexual behaviors should be and not sticking to what is a natural sexual development. And again, from my earlier conversation, if they're growing up in a home where they're not allowed to ask those questions, then those thoughts that are unrealistic sit within that individual. And where they normally get their information is usually social media, which again is unrealistic information. What we also see from males is, again, being weak, not being man enough. Crying is a sign of not being strong. And so in order to show your strength, it's usually with your hands or with your loud voice. And that doesn't always necessarily work in our society. Not being an athlete is very significant for most males. Do they have to be fast enough? Do they have to be able to curl 100 pounds? Do they have to be able to bench 240 pounds? And if they're not, it must mean that there's something wrong with them. And also not being smart enough as well. Usually when that happens, of not being smart enough, you see an overcompensation of being very strong. An individual who shows a lot of athletic ability because they want to hide this thought that they have and this feeling of I'm not smart enough. So you'll see this overcompensating one or the other. So as I mentioned, with social media, and again, this is not a knock on all social media because we can all use social media in a very healthy, connecting way. I just think at times what happens is when it starts to gravitate towards shaming, it can lead to unrealistic expectations. So here, are some examples that I come across, and these three are not the only three that are related to shaming, but just the ones that we typically notice. Public shaming, this kind of started around 2000, 2004 with MySpace. For those of you, that was a precursor to Facebook, before Facebook. What we started to see was parents who would do these things of parenting where, they would get on their tractor, their riding lawnmower, and after they've told their kids to get off their PlayStation about 3 or 4 times or 10 times, they put it in the yard and then they run it over and they YouTube it, or they put it on Facebook or MySpace. And or they would also do it to their CDs, but most people don't use CDs anymore, so they don't do it so much for that. But a lot of times what happens is society will say, that's a good parent. That's a great job doing that, holding your kid accountable. However, the question is, who was that video for? Was that video for the parent to get approval from society? Was that video to shame the child? What would be the function of that video? Because to me, parenting should be a very intimate interaction that one has with their child, of being able to provide a space to their child to share how they're feeling, to be able to be vulnerable enough to process their shame, their sadness, their anger. And a lot of parents, might say, well, that takes too long. That's difficult. Parenting is difficult. That's how it goes. Parenting is not as simple as writing over a PlayStation so that your kid doesn't play video games anymore. That's just not going to fix it. Sexting is something that we see, unfortunately, very quite often nowadays, where an individual might take a picture of themselves, send it to their boyfriend or their girlfriend, or just a friend in general, and then it gets forwarded to other individuals who that photo shouldn't have been sent to. Or what happens is that their account gets compromised and then it gets sent all over the place. So just imagine having your naked pictures everywhere. I remember my grandmother used to have like that Rolodex that she would show her friends at the salon, right? But you can't show everybody that, right? It's just once in a while she could show those pictures of me in the bathtub. But if it's on Facebook, then everybody can see it. And so most people in here are grown adults. And you have to have an amazing ego strength to be able to manage the amount of shame and emotion that comes from knowing that everybody's going to be able to view pictures and videos of you in a compromising manner. Another one is, again, unrealistic expectations. As I mentioned before, the makeup, I see this all the times on the Instagram and Facebook. There's this long videos of how to put on makeup. You see these in the magazines. You see these at CBS or at other places where it's very photoshopped and it's unrealistic. And we as typical individuals have to live up to that photoshopped person who you're hoping that if I buy that mascara, I'm going to look as good as that person. It doesn't work like that. So what do? We buy the next one, and we buy the next one, right? Because we want to reach that picture. And then in fitness, you have people who their job is to work out. That's all they do, okay? And then they post a video about it, and then we see it. And guess what we start to do? Push-ups, sit-ups. We start to run. And then we say, you know what? This is too hard. I don't know how this person does it, but it's too hard. But we go back and we watch it again because we want to change. And again, it's unrealistic. That person's sole goal is to be able to show you, a very, very fit body, which for a typical person is just not achievable. It's just not going to happen. And again, what starts to occur is we start to have this feeling of shame of there must be something wrong with me because I can't meet that expectation. And lastly, like I said, it never goes away. Unless it's some type of crime and it gets removed from several databases, it's usually there forever. So when you post something on Facebook, pictures and stuff like that, it's there. It's not going to go anywhere. And it's not like my grandmother's thing that she hides somewhere now. It just will always be there. And the last thing is there is no break. And I know I'm getting a little bit older now when I say in my day when we just had the landline, you would come home, the landline by the kitchen with the squiggly line. You would come home and that was it. If somebody wanted to talk to you, they would call you, but usually, they didn't. But the pictures themselves, they wouldn't occur. I know, sad. So there was a break and you would be able to do something else. Whatever that was, your imagination or whatever, but you would be able to do something else. Nowadays, this is what we see. There is no break. There is no break from Instagram, WhatsApp. Everything that they do is documented 24/7. And again, it's how many likes do I get? What did so-and-so do on her summer vacation? I need to be able to go through the Appalachian Mountains, and if I don't, there must be something wrong with me. Really? No. So no breaks means that ongoing pressure that an individual has. So the impact of shame, we'll talk a little bit about this, is that you'll start to see a combination of these difficulties over time. Now, this is more on the deep end of what happens if these behaviors, these thoughts, start to become more compounded for an individual. And when I say compounded, what happens is if they unfortunately are a victim of sexual abuse and then it happens again and again, then that thought starts to become much more powerful and starts to impact other areas of their life. So what we start to see is unhealthy eating habits, whether it's overeating or undereating to try to live up to a certain expectation or try to manage some type of emotion that they're having, substance use or misuse, usually to try to cope with an issue that they have, they'll use a substance to try to deal with it. Because remember, if I grow up in a home where I'm not supposed to talk about sex or I'm not supposed to talk about something that I'm uncomfortable with, I still have to process it in some way. I still have to deal with it in some way. And if drugs are available to me and drugs work, I'm going to keep using them. And if I start to use them, I'm going to build up a tolerance. And that tolerance is going to keep growing eventually to an unhealthy level that's going to affect also other areas of my life, like my friends, my school, and so on and so on. Isolation and avoidance. As I mentioned earlier on, this is almost like putting your hand on the stove. If you experience something and it burns you, you're not going to do it again. With my situation, I can tell you I've only been late to class twice in my life, and I can clearly remember them. It will never happen. I'm always the one at the door whenever the teacher opens it. I will never be late again in my life because I don't want to get burned ever again. all right? And so I'm going to avoid as much as I can to make sure that that situation doesn't happen. Unhealthy sexual behaviors, I'll let them transition. So with unhealthy sexual behaviors, as I mentioned earlier, if my parents are not comfortable talking about sexual development, whether it's who to date or how I'm transitioning in life, I need to get that information from somewhere else. If I go online, there's no way of knowing what information I'm going to get online. If I get it from my peers, I have no idea if it's going to be the best information. I can guarantee you it's not, okay? Because peers always give like these crazy thoughts, okay? But it sticks with you, and you continue to do them over and over again, and even until marriage, and then that could start to erode some of your marriage life as well. Next, we kind of go into self-injurious behavior. So this is where individuals start to cut themselves. This typically is females, but we have seen males across the time cut their arms, their thighs, their lower legs, other times burning themselves as well. Because again, they're trying to externalize this strong emotion of shame that they have internally. So even through that physically painful manner, they're still going to do it so that they can change the way that they feel. Running away, again, is an avoidant way to run away from something that's causing me so much pain. I don't want to deal with it anymore, so I can't manage the intensity of that situation. Low self-esteem and self-confidence really goes hand in hand with a lot of these right here, because if I have low self-esteem and low self-confidence, I don't have the thought that I'm going to be able to overcome whatever is in front of me. So I would rather avoid or attack the situation in a much different manner, and usually in an unhealthy way. And finally, the most detrimental really to our society and our kids is suicide. When that thought, that emotion of shame builds too much, and the thought that I just can't move forward with this anymore, an individual may lead to taking their life by suicide, which is very unfortunate in our lives. Good. So this is a good item that I found. It's from Nathanson, 1992, but it is still very relevant today. What he proposes is that we have a compass of shame that occurs in all individuals. And what you'll see, similar to what I've already been talking about throughout my presentation, is most individuals who experience shame will then respond in one of those four quadrants. One, I either attack myself. So you'll see in the bottom left it says, let's see what we have here. I repeatedly think about my imperfections, so there must be something wrong with me. Or we go into, I soothe myself with distractions, such as avoidance, because I don't want to deal with that anymore. We could then go into, I withdraw from the situation, which is the right quadrant. And then the last one, I get angry with them. So the majority of individuals, whenever they feel shame, will go into one of those. I myself went into attack myself because I saw that as there was something, again, wrong with me that I didn't get ready fast enough. So definitely would encourage you guys to watch his YouTube video. He's got a pretty good one as well. So this leads us to, what's the role of caregivers? What's the role of adults? Most of us in here are adults. And so the role that adults can play is really twofold. One, it can be very healthy, or one, it can be very unhealthy. Adults are, we have this great position of being able to extinguish a thought and that emotion of shame that a child can feel and help them explore it a little bit more in that moment and help them recorrect it. Or, because they trust us and because they love us, we can compound it and reinforce that what they're feeling is accurate and not help them process it and not help them move through it. So going back to my story again, that would have been a great time for my mom to say, you know what, your dad just didn't want to go fishing with you. Don't worry about that. Let's do something else. That was a key moment there that I do think that my mom could have shifted there. It is easier to say from my position, that adults need to have that responsibility because it is always easier said than done. And the example I'll show you or share with you is like with my daughter. So now that she has learned that if she doesn't get her way, she would just throw herself on the floor and start crying, and she'll hold her head like this, and I'm re-traumatized here. I'm like, no, let's go fishing, So it's not perfect. So what I have to do is I have to wait. I have to give her the opportunity to feel sad, to feel angry because I said no. And that's hard work. But again, being a parent is hard work. Being an adult is hard work. But we have to be the role models to be able to allow that space and allow that time for them to develop that emotion. And usually that emotion is also empathy. Now, when we say empathy, and I'll talk about this a little bit later, most of us are not kind enough to ourselves. So it's hard to be empathetic with other people if we don't have empathy for ourselves. This could also be true if we're not taking care of ourselves. So I know that I have to go running for 3 miles every single morning because if I don't, when I come home, my fuse is going to be very short. And my ability to be empathetic with my daughter is going to be that big. Okay? And my response is going to be more avoidant, more attacking, and I have to be mindful of that. And so it is a process over and over again that as adults, we need to practice that because children, all adults, we were all children at one time, we all have that irrational thought. We all have that ability to blame ourselves first before we start to find the answer somewhere else. It is a natural thing that we all have. Good. So, one of the other things as adults that us therapists, or some of you have also started to notice, is a topic that we call lawnmower parents. Have you guys heard of this? So a lawnmower parent is a parent that, old school lawnmower there, runs over all the opportunities, whether they're struggling, failures, and challenges, so their child doesn't have to feel that. Okay? It is difficult to see a child struggle. It is difficult for me to see my child fail. It is very difficult. And so I very quickly want to help her get up the ladder. I very quickly want to help her do something and not let her struggle. However, what that does, though, is it doesn't allow a teaching opportunity for my daughter to feel and struggle and then build resiliency. So as adults, we need to allow that to happen. And again, that's easier said than done, to see a child struggle. Whether they're your own child, biologically, an adopted child, it doesn't matter. If you're mentoring this child, you're going to feel that feeling of, this is really tough for me, and let me take care of that for you. But we need to let them struggle in some way so that then we can help them with whatever negative thought that they might be having. Because that's life in some sense. So vulnerability is good, is really what I wanted to make sure is vulnerability of making a mistake, vulnerability of failing is okay. And a child has to be allowed to fail and then empowered to do it over again so that they can succeed. But if we don't allow them to be vulnerable, then they're going to struggle later on in life. One of the topics, research that's called grit, teaching a child to have grit, is allowing them to be resilient, allowing them to be self-confident, to make decisions, to overcome challenges. And if we don't give them those opportunities, then they won't reach that capacity to have grit. So again, how do we break the cycle of shame? We want to work on the irrational thoughts of, am I the problem versus I have a problem. Again, my daughter is not old enough to say that right now, but I can guarantee you in about 6 months, she probably will start saying that. I'm a bad kid, you don't love me, and all those nice words that come with it. And I will start to correct her in that, of you're not a bad kid. Let's just think about a different choice to make here. How can we manage this differently? So I'm helping her take what she has internally and changing it externally. And then I reinforce it so that she does it again and she's able to overcome it. Brene Brown says, secrecy, silence, and judgment. You have those three things, shame will continue with an individual. Okay? If you have secrecy, an individual will not share how they're feeling. And that thought and that emotion will continue to breed within the individual. Same thing with silence, very similar. If they're not able to process it and they keep it to themselves, no one else knows about it. And the judgment. We all get judgment in some way, but too much judgment, too much unhealthy judgment from an adult can be very unhealthy. The role of empathy. If you're able to develop empathy in an individual, you're able to love yourself and care for yourself. And then you're able to take care of that thought, or a lot of those thoughts of, I'm not good enough, I'm a failure. With a lot of empathy, you can change those thoughts to, I am good enough, I will succeed. One trusting adult to promote confidence and redirect thinking. Research says many times over and over again, one adult is all it takes. One trusting adult to help an individual change their way of thinking, to change their emotion. Literally, a lot of times it's all it takes. Okay? One adult who can help an individual shift their way of thinking. And then socializing. Socializing usually goes up with secrecy and silence, where when you have more socializing, you have more individuals who can help you correct your way of thinking. So counseling strategies. For those of you that are counselors, therapists, for those of you who might refer children to counseling services, I'll break down some of the things here that you may want to ask or you may want to work with. Cognitive behavioral therapy is probably the grandfather of all interventions that most therapists utilize when they work with children. It's that wheel that I showed you of cognition, behavior, and then action. And so a cognitive therapy intervention will be to address how an individual thinks, how they feel, change their action, and theoretically, you'll be able to change the structure. With play, stand, and art therapy, these are usually better for younger children, children who may not have good verbal skills. What children do is they play out what they need to say. And it's very beautiful to see that if an individual hates themselves or doesn't think that they're good enough, you'll see this in their play, where they allow you to beat them over and over and over again. Or, as they get better, the rules start to change and they start to succeed and they start to allow themselves to win at some of the games. Eye movement, desensitization, reprocessing. It's a mouthful. In the acronym, it's EMDR. EMDR is a very powerful intervention that, if utilized correctly, instead of using about years or 12 cognitive behavioral therapy sessions, EMDR can usually treat some of this within about 3 or 4 sessions. It is a very powerful instrument, as I said. For most of my life, I did a lot of internal work with CBT, cognitive behavioral therapy, to try to work on my anxiety. It wasn't until I went for training for EMDR, and we have to practice that on ourselves, that my teammate had me think about the first time that I felt anxious about not being on time. And guess where I went? To that time that my dad didn't want me to go fishing. And I was able to reprocess it. And once I reprocessed that thought, there was like a domino effect to everything else in my life where I felt anxiety. And so the next one's really just talking about shame, just getting it out of the individual, because avoidance can continue to increase shame. Self-awareness, being comfortable with the uncomfortable. As I said, being vulnerable, being I don't want to say naked, but being okay with who you are. Okay? So I'm going to leave you guys with this. Again, Brene Brown, strongly recommend that you guys read up on her. She says, if we can share our story with someone who responds with empathy and understanding, shame can't survive. And what I leave you guys also with is, as adults, will you be that person? Okay. Thank you.